Imagine walking into a medieval town for the very first time. The cobblestone streets are narrow, hemmed in by crooked wooden houses leaning toward one another as if whispering secrets overhead. Market stalls crowd the square, fishmongers shout. Their wares, butchers hack away at meat, and the air is alive with noise and color. Yet before you even see the people, you smell the place. The scent of burning wood mixes with roasting meat, the sour tang of ale, and beneath it all, the unavoidable stench of waste and sweat. This is the Middle Ages, a world without deodorant, antiseptic sprays, or modern plumbing. But contrary to what we often imagine, medieval people did not live in complete filth, nor did they simply accept the grime of daily life. Hygiene was a constant concern, sometimes practical, sometimes spiritual, and always shaped by the limits of their world. We carry a stereotype that medieval men and women never bathed, that they trudged through life coated in dirt, and that Europe was one long cesspit until the Renaissance saved it from its own stink. But this is more legend than truth. In reality, hygiene in the Middle Ages was complex, woven from layers of necessity, belief, and class. Some of it was shockingly sophisticated, and some of it disastrously misguided. There's secrets hidden in bathhouses, monasteries, castles, and even humble peasant huts reveal a society that cared deeply about cleanliness, though often in ways we would find strange or even horrifying. To begin understanding medieval hygiene, you must first strip away the illusion of modern convenience. Imagine living without running water. Every drop you drink, every jug you pour for washing, must be fetched from a well, a river, or a rain barrel. Imagine living without sewers. Waste flows through open gutters or festers in cesspits dug just outside your door. Now imagine disease looming constantly over you. Plague, dysentery, fevers, all mysteries without explanation. Cleanliness wasn't just about comfort, it was a matter of survival, though the rules of what was clean often followed superstition rather than science. Step into a noble household, and you might be surprised by the efforts made to combat filth. Lords and ladies bathed, sometimes lavishly, using heated water perfumed with herbs. They washed their hands before meals, wiped their mouths with linen, napkins, and even took pride in combing out their hair with fine-toothed combs made of bone or ivory. Their halls might be strewn with rushes or herbs, partly to freshen the air, partly to cover the filth beneath. To be clean was a mark of status. But walk into a peasant's hut, and the reality shifts. Here, water is a precious resource, and a full body wash is rare. Instead, peasants cleaned their hands, faces, and feet, often in cold water. Their floors might be bare earth and smoke. From the hearth climbs to everything: clothes, hair, and lungs. Soap is expensive, sometimes homemade, sometimes replaced by sand or ash for scrubbing. Yet even the poorest made efforts. Children were scolded for dirty faces, clothes were washed. In rivers, and combs were used to fight lice. Cleanliness mattered, but poverty set the limits. One of the most shocking realities is how central smell was to life. To us, odor is something to be eliminated, erased by perfumes and disinfectants. In the Middle Ages, smell was unavoidable, and it became a kind of language. The scent of your clothes, your home, even your breath, all spoke volumes about who you were. A noble reeking of roses and musk announced wealth. A peasant smelling of sweat and smoke announced labor. People judged one another not only by how they looked, by how they smelled. And then there was fear. People knew that dirt and foul air made them sick, but they misunderstood why. To them, disease came from miasmas, poisonous vapors rising from rot and filth. This belief shaped hygiene in strange ways. Some avoided baths, fearing hot water opened their pores to let in illness. Others carried herbs, vinegar-soaked cloths, or even flowers to block out dangerous odors. Hygiene was as much about warding off unseen forces as it was about washing dirt from the skin. As you stand in that medieval street, nose assaulted by layers of scent, you begin to realize something important. Hygiene in the Middle Ages was not an afterthought. It was an obsession, a constant negotiation with the world's filth and danger. They didn't always succeed, but they tried harder and in stranger ways than you might ever expect. And to uncover their shocking secrets, we must walk further into their world, into the bathhouses, the kitchens, the latrines, and the plague-ridden streets where their ideas of cleanliness shaped life and death alike. Step through the gates of a medieval town, and you might be surprised to hear the laughter and chatter spilling out of a building with rising steam curling from its roof. This is not an inn nor a tavern, but a bathhouse, a place where people gathered not just to wash, but to live a slice of communal life. For centuries, public baths were as common in Europe as they were in the ancient Roman world, and for many townsfolk, they were the only chance to soak in hot water. To us, they might seem primitive wooden tubs, steam-filled rooms, buckets of water hauled from wells or rivers, but in their own time, they were a marvel of comfort and ritual. Inside, the air was heavy with warmth, thick with the scent of herbs like rosemary or lavender tossed into the water to cleanse and perfume. The wealthy could pay for their own tubs, perhaps even with servants attending them. But most common, folk stripped down together, men and women alike, into great heated pools. At first, this mingling was entirely ordinary, a reflection of the older Roman tradition. Bathhouses were places for gossip, for business deals, and even for meals, as some brought food and drink into the steam. To bathe was not simply to scrub away dirt, it was a social ritual, an experience bound up with pleasure, intimacy, and community. In many medieval cities, bathhouses were the beating heart of urban cleanliness. They were operated by guilds, regulated by city laws, and sometimes even sponsored by local lords who understood their importance in maintaining the health of their people. For a coin, anyone could buy a few hours of warmth and water, emerging refreshed and lighter. Imagine the relief of a peasant who spent their days in mud and toil, suddenly sinking into hot water as the aches of the body melted away. But bathhouses carried shadows as well. Some became notorious not only for washing, but for indulgence. In certain towns, they doubled as brothels, and the mingling of sexes became fodder for gossip and scandal. Moralists warned that such places encouraged sin, while clerics frowned upon their licentious reputation. Yet they remained popular, tolerated because they fulfilled a basic need, the need to be clean. For centuries, they thrived as a strange blend of necessity and temptation, cleanliness and vice. The decline of bathhouses did not come because people suddenly lost interest in bathing. It came because fear replaced desire. When plague swept across Europe in the 14th century, killing millions, people began to distrust the very water that once brought them comfort. Physicians warned that hot baths opened the pores of the skin, leaving the body vulnerable to the poisoned air believed to carry the Black Death. What once seemed healthful now seemed deadly. Steam rooms emptied, bathhouse doors closed, and what had been centers of cleanliness and sociability became symbols of danger. The suspicion lingered. Even centuries later, some Europeans bathed only sparingly, dabbing themselves with cloths soaked in vinegar or perfumed water instead of submerging in a bath. The age of communal bathing was passing, giving way to a world where washing became private, limited, and cautious. But before their fall, bathhouses were a vital part of the medieval rhythm, a reminder that life in the Middle Ages was not simply about enduring filth, but about seeking warmth, relief, and a measure of dignity in a harsh world. And yet, not everyone had access to these steaming sanctuaries. Outside the city walls, peasants still relied on rivers, streams, or wooden tubs filled at home. Their washing was brief, cold, and practical, far from the indulgence of scented bathhouses. For them, bathing was not an escape but a chore, a task performed when time and water allowed. This divide between communal comfort and private hardship reveals a truth that runs through all of medieval hygiene. Class determined everything. Still, for those who could, the bathhouse was an oasis, a place to strip away the grime of work, if only for a little while. It was here, in the steam and murmur of voices, that medieval people revealed one of their most surprising secrets. They longed for cleanliness, they sought it eagerly, and they created spaces where, for a few coins, they could reclaim it together. But outside the baths, another struggle awaited. The water they drank, often more dangerous than the dirt they scrub it away. Step outside the bathhouse, back into the bustle of a medieval town, and you quickly realize that while people had found ways to wash themselves, what they drank was another matter entirely. Water, the very essence of life, was both precious and perilous. To us, a clear stream or a cool well might look inviting, but for those who lived in the Middle Ages, every sip could hide unseen dangers. Wells stood in the middle of town squares, rivers wound their way past villages. Rainwater collected in barrels, but purity was never guaranteed. A single dead animal upstream, a latrine too close to the well, or waste dumped into the river could turn water into a carrier of death. It is no wonder, then, that medieval people often distrusted plain water. They noticed, even if they could not explain, that those who drank water directly from streams or cisterns often fell ill, while those who drank ale or wine seemed healthier. Out of this observation came one of the great secrets of medieval life. Water was rarely the drink of choice. Instead, daily hydration came in the form of beer, ale, or diluted wine. These drinks were not just for merrymaking, they were survival itself. The fermentation process killed harmful microbes, though no medieval person could have explained it in such terms. To them, beer and wine simply felt safer, and safer often meant life. Children drank what was called small beer, a weak, low-alcohol brew made for daily use. Workers carried it into the fields in leather flasks, and households brewed it in great vats, a staple as common as bread. In the monasteries, where rules often limited indulgence, beer was considered nourishment, not luxury. Wine held a higher place, favored by nobles and clergy, though watered down and consumed in great quantities. The truth is, most medieval Europeans were in a near-constant state of light intoxication, not from revelry, but from necessity. This mistrust of water extended to its use in cooking. Soups, porridges, and stews often relied on broth, ale, or wine as their liquid base. Where water was unavoidable, people sometimes boiled it or flavored it with herbs, an attempt to improve both taste and safety. Yet, boiling was not routine, for fuel was expensive and fires were laborious to maintain. The poor often had no choice but to drink whatever their wells or rivers provided, taking their chances with fate. In the cities, where populations swelled, the problem became worse. Waste ran through gutters, cesspits overflowed, and water sources became easily tainted. To stand in a medieval street after rain was to see filth carried away in streams, some of which might run directly into the wells people depended on. Even in castles, mighty fortresses of stone, water security was a constant concern. Engineers dug deep wells within walls or built elaborate cisterns to collect rain, for to lose safe water in a siege was to lose everything. Yet, there was also ingenuity. Some towns, particularly in late medieval Italy and Germany, began building aqueducts and fountain systems, controlled by city councils to provide cleaner water. These advances, though rare, hint at a world that was not simply backward, but constantly experimenting with solutions. Medieval people may not have understood bacteria, but they understood corruption, how water left to stagnate became bad, how clear running springs were better than still pools. They shaped their habits around these perceptions, carving out practices that gave them a fighting chance. Still, the image remains vivid. A child filling a jug at a town well, unaware that unseen poisons swirl within. A knight drinking wine before a battle, not for pleasure, but because water could sicken him. A peasant family passing around mugs of ale as their only reliable drink. The irony of the Middle Ages is that the most natural drink in the world was the most dangerous. And so they turned to fermentation, transforming survival into culture, giving us the beer halls, the taverns, and the wine traditions that still linger today. But if drink was shaped by danger, so too was cleanliness of the body. For beyond the water they distrusted, medieval people turned to soap, oils, and perfumes to battle the odors of daily life, and in those remedies, another set of shocking secrets awaits. If water was feared as a drink, it was still essential for washing the body, and with it came the tools of cleanliness. Imagine a medieval market, and among the stalls selling meat, bread, and cloth, you might find blocks of rough, gray soap stacked in piles. This was not the smooth, fragrant bar we know today, but a harsh, lye-based cleanser made from animal fats and ashes. For peasants, this soap was a luxury, often reserved for laundry rather than skin. To scrub the body, they might instead use sand, clay, or even simple water rubbed vigorously with cloth. Cleanliness for the poor was a matter of necessity, not comfort. But climb into the halls of the wealthy, and you would find something altogether different. Imported Castile soap, made with olive oil from Spain, was prized for its gentleness and sweet aroma. Nobles used it to wash their hands before feasts, to clean their faces, and to scent their garments. Here, hygiene was elevated to a marker of refinement. Guests at a noble banquet expected not only to eat well, but to wash in perfumed water before touching food. In fact, the act of hand-washing was ceremonial, with servants presenting basins of scented water to lords and ladies as part of ritual dining etiquette. Perfume itself was more than just a luxury, it was a defense. In a world that believed in miasmas, the poisonous airs that carried disease, sweet scents were thought to protect the body. Nobles carried pomanders, small balls filled with spices, herbs or resins hanging from belts or tucked into gloves. Gloves themselves might be perfumed with musk or ambergris, ensuring that the noble's very handshake announced their wealth and cleanliness. For women, floral oils were dabbed onto hair or veils, leaving a fragrant trail in their wake. For peasants, perfumes were beyond reach, but they found other ways to mask odors. Herbs like lavender, sage, and rosemary were hung in homes, strewn across rush-covered floors, or boiled into wash water. Smoke from hearth fires clung to everything, giving clothes and hair a pungent, earthy scent that, while unpleasant to us, became part of daily life. Cleanliness here was practical, enough to keep lice at bay, enough to keep the neighbors from gossiping too loudly about neglect, but never the indulgence of costly oils or scented gloves. Soap itself became a symbol of class divide. A peasant woman might spend hours pounding laundry in a river, her hands raw from the rough soap she used, while a noblewoman's maid delicately lathered imported Castile onto fine linens. One struggled against grime with tools that hurt as much as they helped. The other turned hygiene into art. This stark contrast reveals a truth about the Middle Ages. Cleanliness was not only about health, but about identity. To be clean was to be civilized. To be perfumed was to be powerful. And yet, beneath the layers of soap and perfume, another battle raged, the battle against parasites. Lice, fleas, and mites infested even the finest gowns and the richest beds. Combs were as essential as soap, and the wealthy often commissioned them from ivory or carved wood, both functional and decorative. Perfumed oils helped, but they could not drive away every creeping thing. Even kings were not immune. Records tell of monarchs being deloused by servants, a reminder that wealth could not entirely conquer nature. Still, for the medieval mind, appearance mattered as much as actual cleanliness. To smell of roses, to wash before meals, to show smooth hands without grime, these were signs of status just as much as fine clothes or jewelry. Cleanliness was performance, and the audience was society itself. Yet hygiene went beyond the body. If soap and perfume guarded the skin, what about the mouth, the teeth, and the hair? In those, we find even stranger rituals that reveal how medieval people sought to control, not just how they looked, but how they breathed, spoke, and smiled. And that is where we turn next, to the secrets of grooming, the tools of vanity, and the hidden war against decay. If the body could be washed with soap and perfumed oils, the mouth was another battlefield entirely. Medieval people, though without dentists in the modern sense, were acutely aware that bad breath and rotting teeth carried both social shame and physical misery. Imagine a feast hall. Golden goblets clink, roasted meats are carved, but across the table, a lord leans forward, his smile revealing blackened teeth. In an age where reputation and presence mattered more than almost anything else, even the smell of one's breath could shape how others judged you. To fight this invisible enemy, people turned to simple but ingenious tools. Claws were used to rub teeth clean, sometimes dipped in salt or ashes to scour away buildup. Twigs from aromatic trees like hazel or willow were chewed until they frayed into makeshift brushes. Powders made from crushed herbs, charcoal, or ground bones were sprinkled over teeth, not only to clean but to freshen the breath. Mint, sage, and cloves were chewed like natural mouthwash, leaving a lingering scent that masked deeper problems. It was a world without toothpaste tubes or dental floss, but the desire for clean breath and white teeth was real and pressing. Yet decay was constant. Sugar, though rare and expensive, quickly rotted teeth among the wealthy who indulged in it. Peasants, whose diets leaned more heavily on bread and porridge, fared little better, as grit from stone-ground flour often wore down enamel, leaving mouths vulnerable to infection. Pain was inescapable, and remedies brutal. When a tooth rotted beyond saving, extraction was the only solution. Barbers who doubled as surgeons would wrench teeth out with crude pliers. Often in public, the screams a common sound in any town square. Relief, if it came, was bought with agony. Hair care was another frontier in the medieval pursuit of grooming. Lice were a universal torment, plaguing kings and peasants alike. Combs were the chief defense, and they were carried everywhere, sometimes carved with intricate designs, sometimes plain and wooden, but always necessary. Noble ladies used oil scented with rosemary or lavender to keep hair soft and fragrant, while men trimmed or shaved as fashion dictated, often leaving their grooming to barbers. Monks, of course, bore the tonsure, their shaved crowns a mark of devotion as much as hygiene. Beards, too, were a statement. A knight's thick beard could symbolize virility, while a clean-shaven face might reflect religious humility or courtly fashion. But regardless of style, keeping the hair free of pests was vital. Ash vinegar and herbal rinses were common treatments, and delousing was an accepted part of intimacy. Mothers picking through children's hair, lovers combing each other's locks, even kings humbly submitting to a servant's careful fingers. Clean hair was not just about beauty, it was about relief. Nails, often overlooked, were also a marker of cleanliness. Nobles trimmed them to neat lengths, sometimes polished with pumice, while peasants often bore the dirt of labor in their hands. Medieval people noticed these details, and unkempt nails or tangled hair could invite ridicule as easily as tattered clothes. In a society where every gesture, offering a goblet, kneeling before a lord, crossing oneself in church, put hands and faces on display, grooming mattered. Yet, even the best efforts could not stop the inevitable. Rotten teeth, lice, baldness, and foul breath haunted all classes. Still, people tried, not because they believed in microbes, but because they believed in dignity. To look clean, to smell pleasant, to show well-combed hair and freshened breath, these were signs of respect to others and to God. Hygiene was not only practical, it was moral. And while grooming touched the body's surface, another realm of cleanliness, or its absence, waited in the darker corners of medieval life. For if bathing, soap, and combs fought against the visible, the question of waste, where it went, how it was handled, and how it poisoned the air was an ever-present nightmare. And so we descend into the world of medieval toilets, cesspits, and the stinking arteries of towns and castles. If soap and perfume could mask a body's odors, nothing could mask the stench of a medieval town's waste. The true battlefield of hygiene was not in bathhouses or grooming rituals, but in the endless struggle against human filth. Every person, from the poorest peasant to the mightiest king, had to relieve themselves, and in a world without plumbing, this daily necessity left its mark on every street, every home, and every castle. In a peasant's cottage, the solution was crude but simple: a chamber pot, often nothing more than a wooden or clay bowl, emptied into a pit behind the house or, if convenience outweighed shame, tossed directly into the street. Picture a narrow alley in a crowded town and imagine the sudden splash from an upstairs window, a cry of warning: guard low. In France, mind the water. In England, before a bucket of night soil cascades down into the gutter below. Streets ran with more than rainwater, and the smell hung heavy in the air, especially in the heat of summer. Castles, for all their grandeur, faced the same problem but dressed it in stone. Here, waste was funneled through garderobes, small protruding rooms built into the castle walls, where a hole opened directly over the moat or a cesspit below. For the noble perched on the garderobe bench, it might feel civilized compared to a peasant's pot, but the reality was grim. Enemies during a siege sometimes crawled through these shafts to infiltrate castles, and the stench wafting up could be unbearable. It was, quite literally, a weak point in any fortress. Cesspits were another common solution, dug deep into the ground, lined with stone or wood. These pits, however, filled quickly, especially in cities. Gong farmers, a profession both despised and necessary, were hired to empty them by hand, often at night, hauling the filth away in carts to dump outside the town walls. It was dangerous, back-breaking work. Many gong farmers suffocated from the fumes or drowned in the sludge. Yet without them, towns would have drowned in their own waste. Public latrines existed in some places, especially near markets or along riverbanks, but they offered little privacy and less comfort. Still, they were better than nothing, especially when overcrowded housing left few options. Monasteries, by contrast, were surprisingly advanced, often building elaborate systems of running water to flush away waste, a luxury made possible by wealth and communal labor. Here, hygiene was a discipline, tied to spiritual order, and monks could afford what peasants could not: cleanliness on a larger scale. The streets themselves told the truth. Gutter channels ran down the middle, carrying off waste, garbage, and rain in one foul stream. Dogs, pigs, and rats picked through the filth, spreading disease as they went. To walk through a town was to walk through layers of smell: fish and meat from the market, smoke from hearths, and beneath it all the sour stench of waste. Travelers from cleaner, more engineered cultures like the Islamic world often wrote with horror of Europe's filth, and not without reason. Yet medieval people were not blind to the problem. They complained about the stench, passed city ordinances forbidding waste dumping in certain areas, and built rudimentary drainage systems where they could. But technology was limited, and necessity often overruled law. If your chamber pot was full and the cesspit was distant, the nearest window was often the quickest solution. Hygiene here was not about perfection, but survival in cramped, dirty spaces. And in these conditions, disease thrived. The waste of cities and castles seeped into wells, poisoned the air, and bred the rats and fleas that would carry death across Europe. The Black Death itself owed much of its devastation to these conditions. To live in a medieval town was to live surrounded by filth, to endure it, and to adapt. But even in the stench, people clung to ritual cleanliness, convinced that bad smells carried sickness and that sweet scents might save them. This fear, born of ignorance yet sharpened by experience, shaped how medieval people understood disease. It led them to strange practices, desperate defenses, and hygiene habits guided more by superstition than science. And it is in this fearful world of plague and misunderstanding that the next great chapter of medieval hygiene unfolds. The shadow of plague hung over the Middle Ages like a storm cloud, darkening every attempt at cleanliness with the terror of invisible death. No event embodies this more than the Black Death of the 14th century, a catastrophe that swept across Europe and killed nearly half the population. To understand hygiene in this world, we must understand not just how people tried to stay clean, but how fear twisted those attempts into strange and desperate rituals. At the heart of medieval medicine was the belief in miasma, the idea that disease came from bad air, rising from filth, rot, and corruption. If a street stank, it was not just unpleasant, it was dangerous. People believed foul smells seeped into the body through open pores, poisoning the blood and corrupting the soul. This idea made sense in a world without microscopes, where the link between rats, fleas, and bacteria was centuries from discovery. But it also meant that hygiene practices could sometimes be deadly. Bathing, once a communal joy in bathhouses, became feared. Physicians warned that hot water opened the skin, making one vulnerable to the deadly vapors thought to float in the air. To submerge the body was to invite death. People abandoned bathhouses in droves, and cities that once rang with the laughter of bathers grew silent. Instead, nobles dabbed themselves with linen cloths soaked in vinegar or rosewater, dry washing the skin rather than risking a full bath. Cleanliness was no longer measured in soap and water, but in layers of perfume, powders, and protective rituals. The sick were often avoided entirely, their homes marked and sealed. Those wealthy enough fled to the countryside, believing that clean air away from the cities could preserve them. Yet even there, fear followed. Doctors wore beaked masks stuffed with herbs and spices, hoping the sweet scents would shield them from the plague's breath. Ordinary people clutched pomanders, small balls filled with musk, amber, or cloves, and pressed them to their faces as they walked through crowded markets, convinced they were breathing in safety. Ironically, many of these practices did little to stop the spread of disease. Avoiding baths, for instance, allowed lice and fleas to thrive, and these parasites were the true carriers of plague. What was thought to be protection often worsened the danger. The very perfumes and oils meant to guard the body masked the crawling pests that brought death into every household. Superstition became another kind of hygiene. Bells were rung to purify the air, bonfires were lit to burn away miasmas, and processions carried relics through towns in hopes of cleansing the streets. Some even believed whipping their own bodies, bleeding themselves in penance, could drive away God's wrath. Disease was not just a physical enemy, it was a spiritual one, and so cleansing the soul was as important as washing the body. The poor, as always, suffered most. With no perfumes to mask odors, no countryside estates to flee to, they remained in crowded towns where death struck hardest. Waste piled in streets, food rotted in markets, and corpses often lay unburied until carts arrived to collect them. To live in these conditions was to breathe in constant fear, and fear itself became part of daily hygiene. People watched the air, sniffed for danger, and turned cleanliness into a ritual of survival. Yet not everything was folly. Some measures did help, even if misunderstood. Burning herbs in homes, washing hands before meals, and using vinegar to clean surfaces likely reduced some risks. Observations that plague spread faster in filth-ridden areas encouraged attempts at waste control. Though far from modern science, medieval people were not blind. They pieced together patterns of sickness and tried, with the tools they had, to resist. But the plague left scars not just on bodies, but on minds. It changed the way people thought about hygiene, pushing them away from communal bathing and toward private, cautious rituals. It made perfume as essential as bread for the wealthy, and superstition as common as prayer for the poor. In this new world, hygiene was no longer only about comfort. It was about survival in the face of an enemy no one could see. And while plague reshaped society's fears, there were places where ritual, order, and faith continued to dictate cleanliness with surprising discipline. In the cloisters of monasteries, where water and washing were woven into daily life, a very different vision of hygiene was preserved. Step through the gates of a medieval monastery, and you enter a world where hygiene was shaped not by fear of plague or the chaos of cities, but by discipline, ritual, and devotion. Unlike peasants or nobles, monks lived in communities bound by strict rules, and these rules extended even to how they washed, ate, and cared for the sick. In the silence of cloisters and the rhythm of prayer, cleanliness was not just a matter of health, it was a matter of holiness. Most monasteries had lavatoria, dedicated washing areas with running water diverted from nearby streams or springs. Imagine rows of stone basins, the air cool and damp, where monks washed their hands before meals and after work. Unlike the peasants, who might rely on a muddy riverbank, monks had the luxury of engineering, aqueducts, channels, and drains that carried fresh water in and wastewater away. The very layout of the monastery reflected an obsession with order, and hygiene was part of that order. Cleanliness to them mirrored the purity of the soul. Bathing was permitted, though regulated. The rule of Saint Benedict, which shaped much of medieval monastic life, did not encourage indulgence, but it acknowledged necessity. Monks could bathe when ill, when ordered by the abbot, or at set times during the year. They were cleaner then. Many imagined, though never extravagant. Hair was trimmed regularly, nails were cut, and the tonsure shaving the crown of the head was itself a ritual that reflected both humility and hygiene. To be unkempt was to dishonor the discipline of the order. Medicine, too, tied hygiene to faith. Monks served as healers, tending to peasants and nobles alike in monastic hospitals. Here, cleanliness was seen as part of care. Herbs like sage, rosemary, and mint were used not only as medicines, but as cleansers, steeped in water to wash wounds or refresh the body. Patients were sometimes bathed, their linens changed, their air purified with burning incense. These practices, while rooted in religious duty, had real effects, limiting infection and offering comfort in a world otherwise resigned to filth. Ritual ablutions were also part of spiritual life. Before prayer, monks washed their hands, sometimes their feet, echoing biblical traditions of purification. Holy water was sprinkled in rooms, not only to sanctify but to cleanse. In this sense, hygiene became a visible symbol of invisible grace, clean skin, reflecting a clean soul. Even peasants who visited monasteries might see this order and associate cleanliness with holiness, reinforcing the idea that purity of body and spirit were linked. Yet monasteries were not immune to the realities of medieval disease. Plagues swept through cloisters just as they did cities, and the close communal life of monks often made outbreaks devastating. Still, the discipline of washing, the use of herbs, and the management of waste gave them advantages over lay society. Records of lower mortality in some monastic communities suggest that their attention to hygiene, however imperfect, offered real protection. The care of lepers was another striking example. Lepers were feared and cast out from most towns, but monasteries sometimes built leprosaria separate hospitals where the sick were tended to with surprising compassion. Washing, feeding, and clothing them was considered an act of mercy. In these acts, hygiene transcended fear and became charity, binding physical cleanliness to moral duty. It is here, in the quiet discipline of monks, that we glimpse a medieval world not entirely lost in superstition. They lacked our science, but they recognized the power of water, order, and care. Their rituals may have been born of faith, but they preserved practices that, centuries later, would shape modern hospitals and hygiene. And yet, outside the monastery walls, the rhythm of cleanliness was dictated less by discipline and more by survival. In the crowded towns and fetid streets, another reality ruled, the reality of smell. For the medieval people, odor was more than inconvenience. It was identity, reputation, and sometimes even a weapon. To understand the Middle Ages, you must first understand its smells. Before the gleam of soap and perfume, before the rush of clean water, people navigated life through a world saturated with odor. Step into a medieval street, and your senses are immediately assaulted. The acrid smoke of countless hearth fires, the sweet rot of spoiled fruit at market stalls, the sharp tang of tanneries working hides, and beneath it all the sour, heavy reek of human and animal waste. For medieval people, smell was not an inconvenience to be banished. It was an unavoidable fact of existence. And yet, smells were more than background noise. They were markers of identity. To walk past a nobleman was to inhale the musk of imported perfume, the resin of incense, the faint sweetness of rosewater dabbed on clothes or gloves. To pass a peasant was to breathe in smoke from hearths, sweat from fields, and the earthiness of wool soaked in rain. Smell spoke before words, telling you who a person was, where they had been, and how they lived. In many ways, odor became a kind of social language. The wealthy invested heavily in controlling this language. Noble women carried sachets of dried lavender or rosemary sewn into their dresses. Men perfumed their gloves with ambergris, a rare and expensive substance from the ocean. Pomanders small, orbs filled with spices, herbs, and resins, dangled from chains, swung beneath noses, or tucked discreetly into pockets. These were not merely luxuries, they were defenses. In a world that believed sickness traveled through foul air, a sweet smell was thought to shield the body from harm. To smell pleasant was to appear healthy, holy, and protected. For peasants, such luxuries were beyond reach. Their homes smelled of the animals that often shared them, of smoke that clung to every garment, of food boiled in the same pot day after day. Herbs sometimes softened the edges, rushes strewn across floors released a fragrance when walked upon, and simple remedies like burning rosemary or sage were believed to clear bad air. But for the most part, the peasant's odor was one of survival, born of labor and necessity. To live in a one-room cottage with a smoky hearth was to carry its scent with you wherever you went. Smells also shaped entire towns. Certain trades were infamous for their stench. Tanneries, which treated hides with urine and dung, often sat outside city walls, pushed away by both law and public outrage. Butchers, dyers, and fishmongers filled marketplaces with odors that lingered long after the day's trade. Travelers from abroad often remarked on the foulness of European towns compared to their own cities, especially those from the Islamic world, where water infrastructure and bathing culture remained far more advanced. To them, medieval Europe stank like a cesspit, and in truth, it often did. But people did not accept this passively. City councils passed ordinances forbidding the dumping of waste in certain streets, or ordering trades to move beyond the walls. Festivals, too, offered moments of escape. Flowers and greenery were woven into garlands, incense burned in churches, and sweet-smelling herbs filled the air. On feast days, even the poorest might smell of something other than sweat and smoke. For brief moments, odor became celebration. Smell could also wound. To accuse someone of being foul was not just an insult to their hygiene, but to their character. A bad odor was linked to sin, corruption, and disease. Medieval texts describe witches, criminals, and the damned as reeking of sulfur or rot. Conversely, saints were said to emit a holy odor, a sweetness that lingered around their relics. In this way, smell was tied not just to health and class, but to morality itself. The medieval world was in every sense a world of smell. It governed daily life, shaped social interactions, and fueled both fear and faith. To live in it was to breathe in constant reminders of your place in society, of your risks, and of your hopes. And as the Middle Ages drew to a close, the myths and truths about these odors began to crystallize into stories that painted the entire era as filthy and foul. But the reality, as we shall see, was far more complex, for medieval hygiene was never as simple as dirt versus cleanliness. It was a spectrum, a struggle, and a reflection of the world they knew. When we think of the Middle Ages today, the first image that comes to mind is filth. Muddy streets, unwashed peasants, castles reeking of rot, and nobles hiding their stink under layers of perfume. It is a caricature, a story we've inherited from later centuries eager to paint the medieval world as dark and primitive compared to the enlightened modern age. Yet, as we peel back the layers of myth, what we discover is not a people indifferent to hygiene, but a people constantly wrestling with it, sometimes succeeding, often failing, always adapting. The truth is that medieval men and women cared deeply about cleanliness, but their understanding of it was shaped by the science, beliefs, and resources of their time. They knew that foul smells brought sickness, even if they misunderstood why. They washed, bathed, and perfumed when they could, balancing necessity with fear. The wealthy flaunted their cleanliness as a marker of power, while the poor struggled to achieve the bare minimum with what little they had. Hygiene was not neglected. It was contested ground. Bathhouses flourished for centuries, offering hot water, herbs, and sociability, until plague turned them into houses of suspicion. Water itself was mistrusted as a drink, but sought after for washing, shaping entire cultures around beer, ale, and wine. Soap, rough and pungent for peasants, delicate and perfumed for nobles, revealed the divide of class as clearly as any jewel or sword. Teeth were scrubbed with ashes and herbs, hair combed for lice, and nails trimmed, all small rituals that made the difference between respectability and shame. The problem, of course, was not intent but infrastructure. Without sewers, towns drowned in their own waste. Without germ theory, people fought disease with perfume and prayer. Without modern plumbing, even kings sat on garderobes that emptied into moats. Cleanliness existed, but it was fragile, always on the edge of collapse. The medieval world's hygiene was a patchwork quilt, one part ritual, one part necessity, one part superstition. And yet, there is something profoundly human in their struggle. In the face of filth and disease, they improvised. Herbs were hung in homes, perfumes clutched like shields, waste carried out in the dead of night by gaunt farmers who risked their lives for the health of others. Monks engineered water systems, peasants scoured clothes in rivers, nobles poured rose water over their hands before feasts. Each act, whether humble or grand, was an attempt to rise above the dirt that threatened to overwhelm them, even smell itself, the most inescapable of all medieval realities, became a kind of culture. To reek was to be low, to smell sweet was to be high, and to breathe in foul air was to risk death. Smell defined morality, class, and even holiness. A saint could be recognized by a miraculous odor, while the wicked were said to stink of sulfur. Cleanliness was not just about health. It was about identity and the soul. So was the Middle Ages filthy? Yes and no. Dirt and waste clung to every street, every garment, every hand. But there was also soap, perfume, combs, and rituals of washing. There was order and discipline in monasteries, laughter in bathhouses, vinegar-soaked cloths in plague-ridden towns, and endless ingenuity in the face of limited means. What we see, if we look closely, is not a people who ignored cleanliness, but a people who fought for it, using every tool they could imagine. And perhaps that is the greatest secret of medieval hygiene. It was never about perfection. It was about survival. To wash was to protect, to perfume was to defend, to sweep away rushes or empty a chamber pot was to hold back the tide of disease for one more day. In this, they were not so different from us. They lived in a world they did not fully understand. But they tried desperately and endlessly to make it livable. As we closed the door on that medieval town, the scents and sounds fading into silence, we are left with a final question. Centuries from now, when our descendants look back on us, what will they say about our own rituals of hygiene? Will they see wisdom or superstition? Will they admire our cleanliness or laugh at our strange obsessions? Perhaps in the end, the difference between us and them is not as great as we like to believe.